Hello and welcome to Very Much Mistaken. The world is opening up. People are doing things in person, but we are going backwards and have gone from in person to remote. So this is the first one we're recording in separate rooms, which everyone has been doing since March. Hence the delay, but we're here now. Hello, James. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Very hot and sweaty in my room, but doing absolutely fine. Just to apologise about my potential microphone quality, sound quality. I don't have the right cables here, so using my old iPhone earphones to record this on. So hopefully only be temporary though.
But you're not in a cupboard and you're not under a duvet.
No. I've got a louder street out the front of me as well, so even more reason to apologise.
So a lot happened last weekend. Bonkers Baku delivered the kind of crazy race that it always tends to, and it was an amazing conclusion to an amazing race, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I remember just audibly gasping when I saw Hamilton go straight on, and it was particularly when you heard them during the red flag over the radio, Hamilton saying, "Let's be careful on our strategy or how aggressive we go, because this is a marathon, not a sprint." And then when you watched it, it initially seemed like he'd gone completely against his own advice that he said to his team. I mean, it later transpired that there was actually a really, really bad but unfortunate error he made in accidentally flicking, I believe it's called the brake magic button on the back of his wheel. It was exceptionally exciting, because at first you thought Hamilton's won it, then within a corner he was at the back. Then the sprint, the mini pre was very exciting to watch as well. You saw Vettel taking second and Gasly, so the podium was all mixed up. Then just as the race finishes, you've got Sergio Perez being told to park his car at the pit exit, because it was like literally running on its last legs by the sound of it. So yeah, it really did have everything, that little ending.
Yeah, the racing didn't end until after the checkered flag instead of at the checkered flag. I think it's worth reflecting on sort of the malaise that befell Stroll but mainly Verstappen, because they were sort of, if you can sort of chalk them off as Mark Webber said this on the Channel 4 commentary. You know, it's the one part of the car that the teams don't have any say on, are the tires, and as such, they are more perhaps than other areas of the car which are so durable now in terms of failures. They're the bits that can go wrong, both in terms of failing on the track, but then also issues in the pit stops. If you think of sort of like the top teams around tire issues, Valtteri retired in Monaco because they couldn't get his tires off, and Verstappen retired in Azerbaijan because his tire exploded. And it kind of, what happened to Verstappen now, I think with 5 minutes to the end, it kind of reminded me of what Formula One races were like up until sort of the beginning of the 2010s, where until the checkered flag dropped, you really didn't know for certain what the order was going to be, because you had this sort of Damocles hanging over everyone's head about reliability. And there have been, famous races in the past. Nigel Mansell in Canada in 91, retiring on the last, the hairpin just before the back stretch from the lead. Felipe Massa retiring in Hungary in 2008 with only a few laps to go when leading. That sort of thing was part and parcel of Formula One, and I think it's something that's been taken away, because however unfair you may have thought that was to happen to Verstappen, it was an incredibly dramatic moment and led to a huge swing in the championship. And it was just thanks to the brilliance of Baku and its mystique that it then swung again at the restart. But do you think Formula One is sort of missing that kind of uncertainty that unreliability brings?
Yeah, I mean, it is funny because it's funny to think how big an impact it had on races previously, and as you said, it wasn't that long ago. Like you look at a lot of the results from like the 2010s, And it wasn't too uncommon to have like 50% of the grid to have like dropped out because of various reasons, whether it was crashing or just like a mechanical failure. And I don't know, yeah, I mean, because they bring in these rules because there was ridiculous problems with just how durable the parts were, because they were essentially, I think you've told me before, making them to fail that race, and if they failed at the end, that's perfect. If they fail too soon, then they haven't done their job right, but they're not there to properly last.
Yeah, you could argue that what happened to Perez, where he literally couldn't go 200 meters beyond the finish line of the race and the finish of the race. That is a car perfectly engineered to complete a race distance and no more, extracting the maximum performance out of all of the parts and delivering it over the course of 50 whatever laps there is. And that was how Formula One was geared until they started. And when they were changing engines from qualifying to the race, completely stripping the car and building them back again, until they brought in sort of Parc Ferme, where you couldn't make changes between qualifying and the race, and then all of the parts had to do more than one race distance. It was very common for these teams with big budgets to completely change the cars from one session to the next and from race to race. And what that meant was, with all of these parts being so finely tuned to deliver the absolute maximum performance that they could over the course of a race, occasionally they exceeded that and failed. And also the other thing, they would fail quite spectacularly. And of course, that was because the teams didn't have the data being extracted from the cars to know that a part was about to explode or give or crack or whatever it is. There are so many sensors on the cars now that a lot of the times you'll see cars will be retired before something breaks rather than after it breaks. So you don't get those big, fiery explosions out the back of the cars or the big plumes of smoke. And again, that was another thing that was kind of exciting. And they said this on the team radio that we get. And I do like this edition with the team radio where you can hear them talking to the race stewards.
Yes, it's new this year, that, isn't it?
And I think that's an extra detail which is interesting, just to understand the dynamics of how the teams communicate with the stewards during the race. And they said they had no warning that the Verstappen's team, said they had no warning that they were going to get this failure. And even that's exciting, because oftentimes this happened to Russell. They've had tire pressure sensors for a long time, but they knew that he had a slow puncher and brought him in before the tire gave way in a significant way. And I think the counter to saying that we're missing an element of jeopardy and excitement by having the cars so reliable now is that there is an element of frustration when a driver has dominated a race, is 30 seconds in front, and on the last lap his car breaks down, sort of Damon Hill-esque in 97 in Hungary. There's a lot of frustration around that, and it's a sort of a potentially, grass is always greener kind of perspective around that. Having said that,
and I would say that I think, like, there's also a kind of too much of a good thing argument as well. Like, in loads of sports, they're trying to have like more of the really exciting things, but as soon as you have more of those things, they become either unexciting or just or annoying. And I think with F1, if you had too many people not getting to the end of a race through no fault of their own, I think that would start getting onto the frustrating side of it rather than the exciting side. And one of the things about Verstappen leading a race and then just his tire blowing and crashing and having to retire was that it's very rare to see something like that. So the kind of drama that comes with that scarcity, it was really exciting to see, and you really felt for him, but it was also like, wow, what is this going to do for the race? This is completely changed. Is it going to change how Perez behaves? Is it going to change how Hamilton behaves? How's it going to affect it? Mm-hmm. And you don't get that often, but that's kind of what makes it really exciting. And then on top of that, you have the decision to do a race restart because of it. It all kind of like adds up.
It was sort of revealing my own biases and how I've completely switched from being a Hamilton fan to a Verstappen fan. I was saying they shouldn't restart this race. It's totally unfair. And just knowing that Hamilton would turn second position into a win, and just having that sense, and they should do a count back from the lap before Verstappen retired and take the result from there. That's the fair thing to do. And then ultimately, I was glad they restarted, because we had this tremendous moment. I don't have you seen the little clip of the Channel 4 commentary box of when Hamilton locks up? It's quite funny. Mark Webber does this sort of high pitched shrill scream, and Billy.
Oh, I did hear that on the. I was wondering if that was just if that was actually someone in the commentary box, or they just caught that somewhere else. But
No, it was. I did hear that. And that just reminds you that Formula One is a sport when because you don't often get that kind of fans reacting to exciting moments is such a big part of football, of rugby, of cricket, of stadium arena based sports. You don't often get that interaction on screen, because the focus is on the track, and very often it's annoying if they cut away to fans in the stands cheering something, because you're missing the action. Because unlike a goal where you score a goal, the game stops. In Formula One, you make an overtake, the race is still happening. So if you cut away to fans cheering the overtake, you might be missing something.
Or you cut away to someone in the pits or something like.
And off the back of Monaco and this and the memes that have been created around Lance Stroll interrupting something exciting about to happen. You really do want the director to focus on the action on the race and what's happening. But that just kind of shows that I suppose you never know what twists and turns are going to happen, and this is all building and layering onto the sense that I think everyone is getting, that 2021 is going to be a magic season, and a contest that's going to go right down to the wire. There are going to be different twists and turns, and I suppose to close the loop on sort of the tyre situation, Pirelli came out quite quickly and said that they thought that there was debris on the circuit. I think they haven't come out with a final announcement yet, which I think is due, but it seems that everyone's intuition is that might be bullshit, and it just that's just not a logical explanation. The way the tires are damaged, I don't think is consistent with debris cutting the tire or something along those lines. It looked like it was an outright failure, and the fact that it happened to both cars in a similar area of the circuit at a similar point during the tire's life cycle indicates that there might have been something wrong with the compound itself.
I think, I don't know, they weren't the two drivers that went. I mean, I know, so Stroll started on the hards, didn't he? And he was just about to go into the pits, I think.
Yeah.
Probably that lap, or it might have been that lap, it might have been the lap after it, but he was very, very quickly going in. But I don't necessarily know if he went much longer or was the longest on the hards than anyone else on the grid. And I definitely don't think Max was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I watched a video on YouTube on a channel called Driver 61. And it's the host is never been like a high standard driver, but he's a good quality racing driver, and so he gives some insights onto it. And he said that he spoke to a tire expert, and the reason why it failed is very, very technical, and it's to do with how the structural support of the inner tire attaches to the outer rim of the tire, and how in certain situations that can degrade, and that's what he thinks happened there, and that's why it might not have been consistent on every single car, because it's a very like weird specific thing to go wrong. Right. But I mean, the fact that there didn't seem to be any debris that we saw. Normally you can kind of see whether it was like a slow thing that then just exploded. I guess we'll have to wait and see what Pirelli say. But it was a tough one to judge, because there were plenty of people on the hards that went long.
And well, given that Red Bull's instinctive reaction was to suggest to the FIA, to the stewards, to red flag the race so that everyone can switch tires. And given that's what they did, and it sounded like with that interaction that they were thinking along the same lines anyway, I don't think anyone is believing I mean, then they wouldn't have had any idea, to be fair, what the cause was. So better safe than sorry. So that might not be safe there.
Yeah.
So that might not be an indicator of anything. But but I think you can try. There are a lot of experienced people in F1 who have seen a lot of incidents and kind of can intuit a lot from just from watching something and seeing what happens, and in some instances being able to read from sort of data that they are receiving, specifically with Aston Martin and Red Bull. And I think everyone's intuition is this is a failure rather than damage. And well, we'll have to wait and see for the answer, but I'd be skeptical even if they did say that there was debris, unless they show me a picture.
And to look a little bit bigger picture on this, obviously, so over the big race that made Pirelli have to make changes to their tires was Silverstone last year, where I think there was three drivers having tire failures on the last lap, the fast corners. It was the front left. So they go on.
But just to add slightly different circumstances, because they knew they were dealing with there was communication, wasn't there, between the teams and the drivers to say we've got issues with these tires.
Okay.
So it wasn't an unexpected, but it was still, you know, an issue.
Yeah. But so that meant Pirelli had to say they were going to have to make the tire more durable, so it would be less grippy. They'd have to increase the tire pressures again, which means that there's less grip because the surface area doesn't change of the tire, but if you allow the surface area to change a lot, it means it warps more, which means it can degrade more, which means it can fail more. So they've had to up the tire pressures, and this is all in this is all as a reaction to the fact that cars are so heavy nowadays.
Yes.
And I think it was back in 2010. I think the max car weight was around 600 and something, 620s. It was around just over 600. And since then, it has slowly creeped up to nearly 800. And I can't remember what the maximum weight's gone up to next year, but it's gone up another.
It's going up again,
yeah.
Yeah, I think,
and it causes a problem in that obviously obviously a lighter car will mean that there's less tire degradation than a heavier one, which means that the tires they can use can be grippier, can be softer and grippier, which means they can last, they can either push more or and they're just they're a better tire to drive on than the current lot, which means the racing can be slightly more nippy and close and responsive, and there's less fear in the driver that they can push the car to do what they want to do. And even though the cars are actually faster than they've ever been now, because of the weight and the size, it means that they're pushing the tires to the kind of limit that Pirelli that can do. And it's a funny one, because there are kind of like theories, like these F1 theories, that around the 600 kg mark is the magic number for a car weight in terms of what drives can do with them and what tires can do. And maybe there's something, and there's reasons for the weight going up. It's mainly partly to do with safety, mainly to do with safety, mainly to do with the engines. Obviously, hybrid engines are much heavier than normal combustion, but it's also because they've also just increased the size of the cars quite significantly, and particularly, I think it was the 2017 rules that have done that. In 2017, they wanted to make the cars bigger and faster, and that's actually just made it very difficult, or that's what Pirelli is saying. It makes it very difficult to make a raceable tire, and you kind of now hope that, so in the current rules changes that are coming in 2022, it's all about what's it called, underfloor aerodynamics, not downforce,
the diffuser.
No, Lotus
ground
had
effect.
Ground effect. It's all about ground effect to reduce dirty air, so racing can be closer. I mean, if that's a success, you could kind of see when they make the next big changes, they'd be looking to see how they can make the cars smaller and lighter to again claw back some of that raceability that has slightly been lost with the current size of the cars.
Yeah, I mean, there's a practical, it's probably a minor consideration, but practically a bigger car on the same size track, it's harder to overtake it. They're not as nimble, not as maneuverable, and that's got so many implications, both in terms of how the drivers can drive them, but then also just visually. I think in terms of peak aesthetic watching, Formula One probably peaked in 2005 with or 2004, 2005 with the last of the V10s of in the era of refueling, when the cars were small and they were just exciting. You could see that the drivers were chucking them around, and races then it was a series of 20 lap sprints, and it was exciting to hear the cars being pushed to the limits, see them being pushed to the limits. It was more or less impossible for anyone to pass anyone else, but viscerally, it was a very exciting sport to watch. I mean, the cars are just as fast, if not faster, but yeah, they're just a bit more cumbersome. And Martin Brundle said on commentary at one of the races, they're the size of an SUV. They're big things now, and you see lots of sort of size comparisons between modern cars and old cars, and some of them, if you go back to the 80s, they almost look like they're twice the size of them. And I think they're, in terms of size, they're going to be slightly shorter next year. I think they've got a shorter wheelbase, but the weight is going up, and unfortunately, it's going to be very difficult for them to claw anything back, because as soon as like safety, you're never going to lower your safety limit once you decide to set it at a point. So a bit like the Halo, I think people may still, I don't think the best you can say about the Halo is you don't notice it. No one thinks it enhances the car's visuals, but once you make the decision to have it, you're not going to take it away again. You might replace it with something else that's provides equal levels of protection, but is a bit more aesthetically pleasing and a bit more in tune with the overall design of the car from an aesthetic point of view. But you're not going to get rid of it. And if one of the main factors with weight is safety, it's there's not an awful lot you can do about that. But it's Pirelli in many respects have had a raw deal because of the circumstances into which they were asked to join Formula One. Initially when they first joined in 2011, it was about creating a tire that degraded, so you had multiple pit stops. That kind of era ended in Silverstone 2013, where, a bit like Silverstone last year, there were a lot of failures, and the teams just ran out of patience with these ultra deg tires that you had to make 3 to 4 pit stops a race to get through them. So they had to harden them up a bit and make them more durable. And then on top of that, there's been the weight issue, which has been added in and has grown incrementally since 2014. And people just, I think, quite glibly compare them to sort of Bridgestone and Michelin and the guys that were doing it before them, and think, well, look, these guys had tires that you never had these issues with. One year, Bridgestone, they had to make tires which were good to last an entire race when they banned tire changes in 2005. But it's a completely different formula, and it's a completely different set of challenges that Pirelli face, and they're often they've often been criticised, I think, by the teams for not producing what they see as being good enough equipment for them to go racing on. But ultimately, a lot of the times, that's the teams covering their own backs, because as I said earlier, the tires is the only thing they have no control over. So if they're not running well, if you blame the tires, then you're putting responsibility onto someone else. It'll be interesting to see what they say about what happened in Baku. Ultimately, to close the loop finally on that sort of conversation, the jeopardy of that made the race more exciting. And I think a more exciting race is a better race. It's a better spectacle. And the championship is just as interesting as it was. We've got a new winner in Sergio Perez. And it'll be interesting to see where they go from here. Looking sort of moving ahead, we're sort of returning now to some more traditional circuits, with going to Paul Ricard this weekend, and then 2 races one race in Austria and one in Styria. Have I pronounced that right?
Yeah, we'll go with
Styrian.
that.
On the same circuit.
Although, actually, to be fair, they're both just down as Austria on the
schedule.
They're both just down as Austria on the schedule. So sponsored by maybe a couple of different people, but that's kind of the end.
So so the kind of, after a couple of sort of unusual races in terms of Monaco and Baku, both street circuits, although very different characteristics, returning to purpose-built tracks will probably be seeing a return of sort of track limits conversations, and maybe, I don't know, a return to Mercedes being a bit more on top of things.
Yeah, I mean, both are very much power based tracks. I mean, there's the kind of like double long straight in in France, and then obviously Austria is maybe probably the second fastest track on the grid after in terms of average miles per hour after Spa, I think. So yeah, it's kind of like low downforce places make up for the slow speed corners on the straights kind of thing. Rather like Baku, and which was why it was actually kind of interesting to see Mercedes struggle a bit, and they talk about how their package in terms of the I think Bottas had a higher downforce rear wing, and that meant he struggled. Lewis obviously always manages to seem to get the best out of the car. So it's not necessarily now we've seen now we've seen what happened in Baku. You don't necessarily know what will happen in France and Austria. Obviously, Mercedes have kind of like traditionally struggled on street circuits, but they don't have the kind of like, they don't seem to have that power advantage that they did have previously that meant they kind of won out on these faster circuits such as France and Austria.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, there's still a bit of sort of head scratching as to where Hamilton found his performance from in Baku, because he was nowhere along with Valtteri right up until qualifying basically. And I think I've heard that there's some talk that maybe Mercedes have perhaps worked something out with their car. It certainly seems that it's not as, it's nowhere near as consistent as the Red Bull. It's got a bit more sort of peak potential in it perhaps, and when conditions suit it, it seems that when overheating your tires is an issue, Mercedes is better, and then when the issue is getting temperature into the tires, that's when they struggle. And that's why they were, well, with Lewis in particular, they were flying in Spain, and then Monaco and Baku, it's been a different story for them. But I also think what we're seeing, they've made some mistakes this year, and I think they're mistakes that in the past wouldn't have cost them. But it kind of got forgotten because of what happened subsequently. Their botched pit stop is what got Verstappen in front of Hamilton in Baku, and that's a mistake on top of the issue they had with Valtteri in the race before that. And then there's the mistakes on track that the drivers have made. Hamilton basically got away with it in Imola, but then again in Baku definitely didn't get away with it. And it wasn't quite as simple as what it looked like in terms of him just locking up the brakes and shooting off. But he still made it. Knocking a switch is still a mistake that you made yourself. So I think that's just a sign of how close it is at the front, because whereas in the past Mercedes would have gotten away with these little errors and it wouldn't have cost them anything. Now, because it's so close with Red Bull, these little mistakes are costing them. And I don't know, it seems to me that maybe sort of Red Bull in general, the overall package, I kind of feel like they're growing into this season, particularly Perez. Obviously he literally, his results couldn't have gotten any better, couldn't have improved any more, given he won the last race. But it just kind of feels like the whole team is getting on top of the situation and becoming comfortable with being right at the front, and challenging. And I think that kind of bodes well for them moving forward, even if we're going into a set of races that might suit Mercedes more.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we spoke about on previous podcasts how the kind of like winning mentality that Mercedes built up over the past few years seems to be standing them in good stead, because they know how to win and they know what to do. But maybe we actually kind of thought of it in the wrong way, and maybe there's an element that they've never really been in a proper fight, apart from it for Ferrari for a brief period, but Ferrari in so many times made more mistakes than Mercedes that season, which kind of put Mercedes ahead. Mercedes are now in like a serious fight that they've never properly been in, and perhaps it's now them that are kind of struggling to know what to do in this situation. They're so used to just going out and nailing their game plan. If they make a couple of errors once, it doesn't matter because they've built up so many points and their car is so much better that they've either not lost much or they'll gain it back very, very easily. And Red Bull have kind of been waiting for this moment to be able to perform and be able to push Mercedes, and they're both now trying to get used to thinking on or thinking about how to win this championship, like over the course of the season, and that means that they're both just making errors because they're both in this new situation that they're not completely comfortable with. And it just, as we've been saying, that slight uncertainty amongst the teams breeds uncertainty on the track, and then we get some very, very exciting racing because of it.
And this is so these last two results for Mercedes. So they got let's just go back to this season.
So they got 6 and DNF in Monaco.
6 and a DNF in Monaco, and then
and they got a last and a 11th.
No points.
So last and a 12th in Baku.
So this is the first time. So let me put this. When was the last time back-to-back Mercedes didn't finish either car on the podium in back-to-back races? Back-to-back races, as has happened.
I don't think it's happened in the turbo hybrid.
It has not. You're right. It has to go back to 2013.
Yeah.
For that to have happened, when they were obviously a completely different team entirely.
But they're still very strong that season.
Not they were, yeah. I mean, reasonably.
Not the dominant force. I think they won second in 2013, didn't they?
Hamilton won one race and Rosberg won 2, so they were up there. But that was obviously the last of the Red Bull dominating era.
Yeah.
But yeah, they. So this has been sort of their poorest run in the history of their team as in its sort of current guise, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on, and it'll be interesting to see how they respond to that. They've sort of responded well to pressure, I think, so far this year, but it's kind of amping up, I feel, from Red Bull. And you know, pressure is different when you know that mistakes cost you something. That can have a compounding effect in terms of the amount of tension that builds, and especially if, as we've said, if you're not used to it, as you can debate that Mercedes maybe might not be used to it given how easy they've had things, or sorry, how well they've done in the previous years. So it'll be interesting to see how they respond going to tracks that potentially better suit them. In the next couple of races will help them, but that's no guarantee of anything, really. We are.
And now they're in a serious dogfight. They're going to be really hoping that Bottas can find some form again. I mean, obviously he was actually on for second in Monaco, and people do need to remember that. But he massively struggled in Baku. He admitted it, but he kind of had to. There's no other way of putting it. Like he couldn't. He was stuck behind. He was stuck in 11th behind. I can't remember who for most of the race. Couldn't make a pass, and then dropped places on the restart. So I'm confident that he does have the pace to bring it back and start supporting Mercedes again. But now that Perez is really showing his worth. I mean, obviously, I think that when Verstappen was leading and Perez was in second, you could see that there's still a pace difference between those two, because Verstappen pulled about three and a bit seconds ahead and then just chilled until he went out, basically. Whereas Perez was fighting, admittedly, a 7-time world champion off his back. But now that those two are really performing well. Mercedes are looking like they might be struggling in the constructors if Bottas doesn't come back, and then we're starting to think about. I remember your prediction at the start of this year, which was a Hamilton drivers championship, but a Red Bull constructors. So
yeah, and I also predicted or suggested that Bottas might not make it to the end of the season, and I would say at this point, they make it to the end of the season with Mercedes. I would say at this point that, I mean, that was quite an outlandish claim at the start of the season, but I would say at this point that it is more likely than it was at the start. He's got three third places, 2 retirements, neither of which were his fault at all, and then this absolute dog show in Azerbaijan. I mean, the history books say he finished ahead of Hamilton, but obviously the context there is king. Whereas Perez has gone from sort of well, he's been pretty consistent. He's had a fifth, a fourth, and then this win, and then his 11th place in Imola after his mistake. So he's been pretty consistent, but getting better, obviously, and I think there will be some concern, I think, in Mercedes with the situation in the constructors. That, I mean, these last 2 races, as we said, they've scored how many points do you get for 7th? You get,
I think Hamilton scores 6 points.
You get 6 points. They've 6 points from the last 2 races has really turned the tables in the constructors. And the pressure will be on there. And all I will say is Valtteri's results, regardless of form that he has had so far this year, I do not think is adequate to be maintained for the rest of the season. I think he's going to have to improve in some way if he can, for Mercedes to challenge for the Constructors' Championship. Do you want to? Qualifying sort of came up in both the last 2 races as an area of contention, mainly sort of Q3 and what happens if the session is red flagged by a driver making a mistake.
Yeah, and I think so. They're two slightly different frustrations with qualifying, all to do with red flags, but for 2 different reasons. And in Monaco, we had in a situation where Charles Leclerc crashed out, and then because of that, red flag the session, which meant no one could better their time, which meant he finished on pole. In Baku, we had 4 red flags over the course of the 3 sessions. Mm-hmm. I think, let me just get it up here. So in the first session, we had Stroll. I think in the second session, we had Giovinazzi, and then also Danny Ricciardo in the second one. In the first and second, we had in Q1 we had Stroll and Giovinazzi. Then we had Danny Ricciardo in the second one, and then we had Yuki Tsunoda in Q3.
Well, you could say Tsunoda and Sainz in one go.
Oh yeah.
No, I'm not sure if. Well, Sainz wouldn't have. If Sainz had gone off on his own, it wouldn't have red flagged the session, but there would have been yellow, so it would have ruined people's lap times. But I think. But it would have had an impact, but it would have been different. It would have impacted some, not everyone.
And the Sainz was a reaction to the Tsunoda crash, because he was coming up on that turn. So if Tsunoda hadn't crashed, you could argue that Sainz might not have crashed either. So
maybe. I mean,
he said he saw over the radio, said he saw the crash and lost his concentration, and then he locked the front left.
Yeah. Perhaps he shouldn't have done that.
And so talking about the Monaco one, it seems like, even though it turned out that Leclerc didn't gain any advantage from it because they missed a fault on his car, which meant he couldn't start the race, there was still an advantage gain from a mistake. And part of me thinks that that's not, even though it is very unfair to talk about incentives in these ways, because these drivers, well, we don't actually, there are a couple of examples where we know drivers have parked their cars places.
Schumacher. Rosberg.
But when
both at Monaco, so Monaco's susceptible to this.
Yeah, but when the incentives are aligned in that way, and that there's nothing if you've put in a good lap time, there's nothing kind of stopping you then messing up for everyone else. It does then create these awkward situations where you have this sense of unfairness. And in sport, you kind of want to always see the people who come out on top are the people who've kind of like done the best consistently, and they're at the top of the game, make the fewest mistakes, drive in this case, drive the fastest, and don't crash.
Yeah.
whereas we had a situation where, because of the nature of Monaco, if Ferrari had been more thorough with their kind of like shakedown of the car after the crash, Leclerc could have won the race. And because of that, and also stopping Verstappen putting through a potentially faster lap that made him qualify first. And we see examples of ways of dealing with this in IndyCar, in that if you red flag a race, if you red flag a qualifying session, your fastest 2 lap times are crossed off. And to me, that seems like a way of putting the onus back on the driver to not making a mistake. And I think I haven't properly gamed it in my mind as to how it would affect. But I mean, you could see an instance where if you've crashed in FP2 or FP1, but your lap time is fast enough to put you through, then you're automatically not through anyway. I mean, I imagine if you crashed anyway, you won't be able to go through, or you're put to the back of your queue number. If you crash in Q3, then you're put to the back of you're put to the back of the FP3 grid, so you'll be placed in 10th. Because then you're because then it would incentivize just better driving. It might incentivize more conservative driving around these street circuits, but that's kind of the nature of it. Street circuits are hard, and this is where it goes into Baku, where we had I think it's turn 15 or 16, we had Giovinazzi, Stroll, and Danny Ricciardo going out, and it's a tough corner, but driving a car around a circuit, an F1 car at the top of the game, should be tough. It shouldn't be easy to put a car around a corner, and because it has a drop off just in the braking zone, it means you have to brake a bit sooner. You can lose traction. You can go across into the corner, go across into the barrier. And if you then make it more of an issue, if you crash out like that, it might mean that they might be, the drivers that can push and last will be shown to like do better, whereas the drivers that push and then sometimes make it work but sometimes don't, will do worse. And so then then with another thing with the Baku problem, the Baku incidents, were it just meant the spectacle was really bad. You had 4 red flags over the course of 3 qualifying sessions, which just and as well as the TV crew do in trying to fill the gaps in between there, it's not as fun as watching qualifying. And I think Alonso made the point after his in his post qualifying interview, where he was just like, drivers just have to learn to not push the limits so much if they want to get to the end. And maybe they don't have to learn, they kind of have to be forced. There has to be a stick to say, if you mess up and red flag a qualifying, you will get punished for it. And it's not just you not going through to the next one, you'll drop to the back of the grid, you'll lose your fastest lap time, something like that.
There could be something. There could be something, couldn't there? Where I think there's a logic to that, where whatever session you're in, if you red flag that session, then your lap times from it get deleted, or whatever the punishment is. I think one of the points of qualifying is that it is done. You are qualifying with other cars on the track. If you wanted to eliminate this sort of thing entirely, you would go back to like one-shot qualifying, where everyone does a qualifying run one after the other, which I believe is what they do in IndyCar. And Formula One has tried that. It wasn't as interesting as the current format. And what's been interesting also about this season is that I think only in Bahrain has qualifying in Q3 been settled by the second run. Obviously, Azerbaijan and Monaco were impeded by red flags. But in Spain, Portugal, and Emilia Romagna, it was the first run in Q3 that was ultimately the fastest one run, because of different reasons. But and Max Verstappen's come a cropper with that, where he's made a mistake on his first run, and then hasn't, and then either the conditions have been slow, or he hasn't been able to get it together in his second, and either he hasn't improved or no one has improved. So I think perhaps teams need to recognise that in that last session, because it's really the last session we're talking about mainly, you've got 12 minutes to get 2 runs in. They're both equally important. You want to leave it to the last minute because of the advantages that you potentially gain in terms of rubber on the track, etc. But we've also found this year that isn't the best time to run. So I think maybe the teams and the drivers need to focus on both their runs and understand that the first run is more than a banker lap. It's a chance for you to qualify on pole, because either conditions may change or circumstances may change, which means you can't improve. And if you leave it to the last limit, well, then you're running the risk of coming into a red flag and having your lap time interfered with, and that's qualifying. And that's what it's like qualifying with other cars on the track at the same time as you. Those are the risks you run. You've got 12 minutes with only 10 cars on the track is enough time to have a clear run, where you can have everything turned up, push everything to the max, and go for it. And then it's down to the driver to execute. Monaco and Azerbaijan, obviously, they're not a fair test in terms of red flags because they're 2 street circuits where basically any mistake results in the session being stopped because there's a car in a barrier, and that's something that you've got to deal with. So I think there may be circuit specific, but one thing that's interesting that IndyCar does is they have different qualifying formats depending on if they're on road courses or on oval courses. And even within ovals, the format varies. So I think IndyCar, Indianapolis at the 500, you do a 4-lap run, and your time is an average of those 4 laps. Whatever your speed average is over those 4 laps, that is, you're qualified in that order. On road courses, I think you get to do 1 run, and these are all on your own. And on different ovals, it's a different number of combined laps. It's either 1 lap or 2 laps. So do you tweak qualifying and the qualifying rules based on the kind of circuit that you're on? And if you're on a street circuit, do you have to implement a penalty system like you suggest? I don't think it's necessary on other ones because the chances of a red flag are so little. But in that circumstance, basically, usually if you make a mistake on another circuit, the chances are that's not going to interfere with anyone else's run. Whereas on a street circuit, if you make a mistake, it's almost guaranteed to interfere with other people. So perhaps you need to tweak the incentives, as you suggest, on certain tracks, to give everyone a fairer chance, and to not accidentally incentivize people to make mistakes to give themselves an advantage. But ultimately, yeah, I think teams need to recognize, and the drivers need to recognize, that it doesn't all have to be in the last run. You've got to execute every single run that you do because it's qualifying and things can happen.
Yeah, and I do understand that, I do completely agree that you've got to take your opportunities when you have them. I'm very sympathetic to that side of it, which is why that the kind of argument around Charles Leclerc, he put in a really good lap time, so he should be kind of rewarded for that, even though he went out. But that still doesn't deal with the spectacle side of things, which is, and I get that 4 red flags in a race is a one-off, and it would probably only really happen at Baku and maybe at Monaco.
The risk ones are Baku, Monaco, and Singapore, but that's not on the calendar anymore.
Yeah,
and maybe Saudi Arabia. Not that we've been there yet, but it's a street circuit as well. Russia is sort of like a street circuit, but the runoffs are bigger. And it's same with Melbourne. So your high risk ones are Monaco, really, and Azerbaijan on the current calendar at any rate.
Yeah, and so you could still, because on the purpose-built tracks, red flags aren't going to be an issue because there's runoffs. It's easy to clear up cars. They're not going to be in the way of the racing line, things like that. You can still implement the kind of slightly harder red flag rule, but it's not going to actually happen as much. So it's not really going to have an effect. So it can still be consistent across all the tracks. But the only times it's actually going to be applied is on these street circuits when it should be applied, because it will mean that we won't have to spend like take an hour and a half extra in qualifying to get to the end of it, because too many people are pushing and not driving their car as good as they should.
I'm not exactly. I mean, this isn't. You can't answer this question, but I'm not sure to what extent a driver would change his driving, knowing that if you alter the risks in that way, because ultimately they're making mistakes. They're not doing, they're honest mistakes. They're not doing things deliberately. I mean, it might, yeah. I mean, maybe it would, to be fair, if you think about Charles Leclerc in Monaco, if he's like, right, I'm on pole. If I muck up here, I know I'm not going to be on pole, rather than I might still be on pole. That probably does change the incentives enough to mean that he is perhaps a little bit more cautious going through the swimming pool, doesn't get that little bit closer to the Armco, doesn't hit the Armco, doesn't go off, doesn't red flag the session. So yeah, maybe it would change things. Yeah, I think it's always worth, I mean, you don't know what they'll do about that sort of thing, but it's always worth looking into these things to see if you can improve the spectacle. And because no sport is perfect, and no nothing, no element of it is beyond another look to see if it can be improved.
I have, so, and just one quick little talking point about spectacle. So if you
spectacle or spectacles?
Spectacle. If you remember in San Marino when they did a restart, and they were going to make a decision as to whether it was going to be a standing start or a rolling start. And Michael Massey went with a rolling start, and he said it's because he thinks it would have been in the interest of the sport to go with the rolling start. And we had a discussion around why, and you thought it was the wrong decision because you thought it was you thought he was driving a car whilst it shouldn't be like unnecessarily dangerous. It's still dangerous, and if there's like problems that happen at turn one, then that should just be part of the sport.
Yeah.
Whereas I had a different take on it. I thought because of the wet weather, if you bunched up the grid off, and there was a dry and wet line going happening at the time, the chances of there being a big incident on turn one and therefore red flagging the race again was so high that Michael Massey decided that it would be just within the interest of the spectacle to rolling start, and it's just a slightly more safer and predictable way of starting a race. He then changed his thinking for Baku, and again he said his reasoning was because it was in the interest of the sport. And there were plenty of options he had actually. I mean, I don't think they would never do a rolling start because of the weather, but he could have not done the rest of the race quite easily. 2 laps left, you could have. It's well within his right to call it there because you only need to cover 75% of the race for it to be considered done. But he must have thought that. I reckon there was a part of him thinking this final 2 laps could be a very, very exciting thing for people to watch. Therefore, let's do a rolling start and get this 2 lap sprint done.
You know what? Alonso's performance in those 2 laps, I think, gives encouragement to sprint race qualifying, and also a direction it might go where it's actually a very short sprint, because there is some serious advantage to be gained from pure racing. For people like Alonso, if over the course of a 5-10 lap sprint you can get your elbows out and gain 4 or 5 positions on the grid as Alonso did. I don't know, it probably wasn't quite that many, but there was a lot of chopping and changing going on, which was indicative of drivers knowing they only had a couple of laps to get through. And yeah, it was interesting how, it's always interesting to go back to your point, sorry, where where yeah, the same reason is given and you get two different outcomes. It's kind of like DRS, an umpire's call in cricket, where it depends on what the umpire says is whether something is out or not. And it can be, you know, hitting the wickets, but because the umpire said it was out, it's given out. But because he said it wasn't out, it's not given. It's sort of, yeah, the sort of like the F1 equivalent of umpire's call. I actually think, based on the safety car restart for the Stroll crash, that that in Baku, a static start is safer than a rolling start because you've got this long straight, you've got such a long period where everyone behind the lead car doesn't know when the lead car is going to go. It's basically equivalent of pulling an elastic band further and further apart, and either the first car releases it and they all go, or it snaps and you have what happened in Mugello last year. Whereas at a static start, everyone knows when go is. It's when the lights go out, and that in some respects is safer. I also think because in Imola, because because the red flag was brought out because of a crash going into the point where the restart would take place, and it was partly influenced by the fact you had this wet dry line, that I kind of probably think spooked the stewards and Michael Massey into going for a rolling start, because it was a rolling start into the area where there was just this big accident in difficult conditions. So you're almost kind of like tempting fate to say that this is going to happen again. I still think that it would have been better to go for a static start. But then again, I was angry that they were going for a static start and restarting in Baku, because I thought it was unfair and it was going to give Hamilton an advantage. So it's kind of, this is why they need impartial people deciding these things, because yeah, I wouldn't have restarted and I would have done a lap, which they do anyway. They do a count back when you red flag the race and don't restart it. And I can't remember how many laps they did before the race was red flagged. But
if they'd have done a count back, Verstappen would have been classed as out. Unfortunately, I remember them explaining that.
Yeah. So if they'd red flagged it straight away, then he would have been.
Then he would have. Yeah. Then
he would have been
won.
in. But they went round for a few laps, didn't they?
They went round for one more lap. Then they did a safety car. Then they called a red flag or something.
Yeah.
There was lots of complaints about how late they called it. One on the safety car and then two on the red flag. So
yeah. Well, I can understand why they did, because they were trying to work out what had happened. If you're, that's not, if you're dealing with a large impact, but you're confident, what happens, like a driver's just made a mistake or there's been a collision, then there's no thinking time spent on why this happened. You're just dealing with the accident, the crash, and trying to work out, okay, does this need virtual safety car, full safety car, or do we actually need to red flag the race? Because there's damage to the barriers, is the reason why they have to rebuild the circuit periphery in some ways. They're usually the only reason why they red flag a race, unless it's because of rain. Whereas in this instance, they didn't know what the cause of the crash was. So they had to spend a bit of time working out what that was, a bit of communications with the team, some of which we heard, before ultimately deciding, okay, we do need to red flag this race. It wasn't to red flag the race to sort out Verstappen's car. It was to red flag the race to give the teams a chance to get onto fresh tires, because we're not sure what's happened here. And you've got to give, they're humans making these decisions. You've got to give them adequate thinking time. And I think it's understandable why it took them the amount of time that it did to process what had happened, make a decision, which was ultimately the right one in the end. But yeah, I mean, there's an argument that all F1 races stop 2 laps from the end and they do a full restart, which I think is kind of how NASCAR works now. They have like stages within races, and I can't be bothered to try and work out what it is, because it all seems terribly artificial. But
you just have like legs. You have like each day you have like 3 legs of a race, and you cover a certain amount of laps to cover the full race, but then you can win each leg or something. Maybe worth.
Do you get points for legs?
Not sure. Need to read up on that, I think, before we.
Yeah, I've been trying to follow IndyCar a bit more closely thanks to Romain, but I can't be doing with NASCAR. One final thing, just a minor detail. I've noticed that the Brazilian Grand Prix and the Mexican Grand Prix are known as the Mexico City Grand Prix and the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. Do you know what that is?
I think the Sao Paulo one is to do with the fact that it's the municipal government that have organized it, not Brazil, and they want to take credit for it.
Uh-huh.
So they don't want it to be the Brazilian one because I think
There's a bit of politics going on.
Yeah. And I think because there was a period I remember hearing that they wanted to call it the Brazilian Grand Prix, and they were like, no, we've put in all the work. We want it to be Sao Paulo. I think it's kind of like an advertisement for the city.
Yeah, of course
and
it is.
I'm guessing like the same thing with Mexico then, because they want it must have been Mexico City that had done the bit, all the organizing for it, and they want to take the credit for it.
Well, the Sky Sports website is not on brand because it is Mexico and Brazil on there, so they need to update that, or else the North and South Americans will be on their case. Any other business?
I just really, really happy that Vettel is finding some form.
Yep.
He's looking. So because I mean, just asked you, has Vettel always been the kind of driver when he's at his peak that's kind of like very like consistent, calculating, and then finds himself in good positions eventually?
I mean,
that seems to be what he's done the past couple of races. He's kind of just executed game plans well and taken opportunities when he's had to.
I mean, Vettel in his 4 championship years, I would say his style was, if he was leading at the start, to go for it at the start, get out before DRS came in, get out of DRS range, and then he can control the race. And he would always do that if he was at the front. If he was in traffic, he would nail in lap, out lap, around pit stops, and make the most of opportunities to gain positions there. And he was so good. His last championship year, he won the last 9 races in a row.
Yeah, it's
crazy.
He
was so consistent at doing that and delivering and putting in the performances week in and week out. And it was, he'd fallen so far from that you'd almost totally forgotten that was what he was like, based on his last few seasons at Ferrari, which were just littered with mistakes, entirely of his own making, and ultimately cost him his drive there. And there were the kind of mistakes which were apparent in Bahrain this year, and it kind of looked like it was same old Seb. But yeah, Monaco, again, it was classic Seb. That period around the pit stops where he nailed those lap times to make the overcut to jump, I think 2 or 3 cars in the end to get up to 5th. And then Azerbaijan, he's qualified in 11th, and to finish 2nd in a midfield team. Aston Martin is the 5th best car on the grid on a good day. So for him to get 2nd, there was some obviously, 2 front runners retired, but you've got to be in a position to capitalize on those situations. And Norris qualified ahead of him in a faster car, but didn't execute his race to the same quality as Vettel did, and ended up finishing behind him. We spoke about McLaren and Ferrari being there to capitalize on when there were issues with the top teams. Well, this was one of those races, and I think Ferrari to not have a single car on the podium after these in Baku was disappointing for them. And it's probably, it was a good recovery job from McLaren based on how the start went, but still they'll be disappointed that they probably didn't do more from that circuit. But yeah, back to your last point. Yeah, and I'm also very happy that Seb seems to be finding some form and getting to grips with the car and the team, and getting his elbows out again.
Yeah. And then final shout out to Pierre Gasly as well. It's just nice to see a mixed up podium like that, isn't it? And,
yeah, we've had 3, Hamilton, Verstappen, Bottas podiums out of 6 races. So 50% of the time, the same 3 drivers have been on the podium. So yeah, it's great to see none of them. I think none of them on the podium in Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
3rd different winner. And again, only one pole sitter has won so far this season. So, for all the chat about pole position and qualifying, it hasn't consistently translated to a strong race performance so far this year. And long may that continue.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we'll be back. We'll be doing 4 weeks in a row, which is a bit of a slog for us because there's France, 2 races in Austria, in 3 weekends consecutive, and then the British Grand Prix 2 weeks after that. There'll be, my eyes are firmly on whether Silverstone gets added to the test, whatever the government's doing with sort of test events, because I think that's the only way there'll be sufficient tickets going on sale for me to be able to go to that. But yeah, we've got France on the 20th, so we'll be back hopefully on the Monday after that with our next episode of Very
Much
Mistaken. Harder to do remotely. Anyway, cool. Cheers. Bye.
See you soon.